Nous avons le plaisir aujourd'hui de recevoir David J, qui a été durant 16 ans expert à l'Agence européenne de l'environnement. Donc vous êtes un fin connaisseur de toutes ces problématiques. Bonjour,
Bonjour.
Monsieur J, c'est un plaisir de vous recevoir. Vous êtes à l'origine de nombreuses publications sur la question. Première question abordée, le principe de précaution.
The precautionary principle was invented in Germany. Of course, precautionary behavior has always been adopted, but the principle itself was invented in Germany in order to deal with a problem they had, which was the death of their forests, a precious asset for Germany, in the 1970s. And it was obviously caused by many different things, and the science was uncertain. But they had to act in order to save parts of their forests. So they decided to focus on one particular problem, sulfur dioxide from burning fossil fuels, and tried to restrict that. But because they were mindful of the constitutional court in Germany, which makes sure that decision makers, politicians and so on, take decisions that are sensible and well grounded in evidence, they invented the precautionary principle to put into their law, which gave them justification for acting when the science was uncertain, but the stakes were high, in that not acting would have led to further damage to the forests, whereas acting could well save a part of the forests. So that's how it became a legal principle. And it has since spread to many other international agreements and into the Treaty of the European Union.
Par exemple?
For example, another example comes from the current crisis with bees, which began in France, where the bees began to die and they began to become disorientated and in general were sick and ill. There are probably many causes for that, but one candidate was a new pesticide that came in, which appeared to be causing some of this damage. And after 10 years of controversy, the French government decided, using the precautionary principle, to ban this particular type of pesticide in 1999. Subsequently, just last year, the European Union decided to ban temporarily 3 of these nicotinoid new pesticides, based on evidence that suggests they were playing a role in the decline and damage to bees. They use the precautionary principle because there is still a lot of scientific uncertainty. There are many causes of bee decline, and this is just one. But we see that the manufacturers of those pesticides are now taking the European Commission to the European Court, arguing that there is an insufficiency of evidence. And the Commission's defence is to say the precautionary principle allows us to take action on lower strength of evidence in order to prevent damage which will be serious and irreversible.
À ce stade, j'ai une question, David. 1970, 1990, c'est finalement assez tard. On voit apparaître ce principe de précaution assez tard. Comment expliquez-vous ce...
Well, I guess decision makers have used precaution. I have a quote from Prime Minister Peel in the middle of the 19th century when saying in relation to the developing famine in Ireland, he says, why should we not be precautionary and take action now before the famine gets worse? So precautionary behaviour has been around a long time, but the principle in law only arrived, as I say, in the 70s in Germany and then into the EU treaty and into international conventions.
So there is another side. Okay.
Yeah. A third good example to illustrate how to use the precautionary principle is the contraceptive pill given to women to obviously restrict births and so on, which was a great product for its time and currently, but unfortunately it goes straight through the females and straight through the water treatment plants and into our environments, where, for example, it is consumed by male fish and turns them all into female fish. This is a worrying early warning signal that perhaps that pill and many other pharmaceuticals, which we know are going through our bodies and through water treatment plants and into the general environments, they could be a problem for us. They're designed to be biologically active. They're at very low levels, but we know from the histories of lead and mercury and pesticides and CFCs and asbestos that the damage that they did, as we got more knowledge, were seen at lower and lower and lower levels of exposure. So that for lead, for example, there is no known safe level of exposure, and similarly for carcinogens. So the low levels of pharmaceuticals in the environment are a cause for concern. What can we do about it? Well, we can decide to be smarter with our chemistry. For example, the current methods of water treatment don't strip out, don't remove these pharmaceuticals, these endocrine disrupting chemicals, but by developing what we call green chemistry, which is kind of smarter chemistry than normal. Normal chemistry uses a lot of high temperature, a lot of high pressure to generate the chemicals we use. Nature, in her exquisitely clever chemistry, doesn't use high pressure, doesn't use temperatures. So we can learn a lot from nature about the use of enzymes and use that knowledge to put it into water treatment plants, such that the costs of stripping out pharmaceuticals and pesticides from the environment becomes much lower. And Switzerland is kind of leading the world at the moment in using clever methods like these enzymes from green chemistry to stop pharmaceuticals and pesticides getting through the water treatment plants. Another example would be antibiotics in food.
J'allais vous poser la question des antibiotiques.
Antibiotics in food was invented because people discovered or observed that some chickens eating the ground and stuff outside a pharmaceutical company were growing fatter and faster than normal. And it turned out they were eating residues of antibiotics. And so people thought, wait a minute, if we put antibiotics into animal feed, then our cows, our chickens, our pigs will grow faster and fatter, much better, which means better profits for the farmer and profits for the pharmaceutical industry. It wasn't long before some of the medical specialists said, wait a minute, putting antibiotics in animal feed will inevitably mean that humans will consume tiny amounts of antibiotics. But is this a good idea? And they said quite clearly, no, it wasn't. But that expert advice was largely ignored. It became available in 1965, but it was another 20 years before concerned consumers and small farmers in Sweden said to each other, this is not a very scientific way of doing farming. It's a simple single-shot way. We need to focus on better farming methods to be able to develop healthy animals that are fat and so on, but without causing these problems in the rest of society. So they persuaded the Swedish government to ban antibiotics in animal feed. When Sweden joined the EU in 1995, the EU said, nobody else has banned antibiotics in animal feed. You have to stop that ban, and we'll give you 5 years. Sweden went away thinking, we're doing the right thing here. So we're going to persuade the rest of Europe to do the right thing. So they commissioned a couple of experts and so on who said it's a mad idea to put antibiotics in animal feed. And they persuaded the rest of Europe on December 1999, at the end of the 5-year period, that Sweden was right and the EU was wrong. And so the EU then banned antibiotics in animal feed. Pfizer, the major pharmaceutical company that put these antibiotics there, decided to take the Commission to the European Court of Justice, arguing that there was an insufficiency of scientific evidence to show that we, humans, would be damaged by trace amounts of antibiotic in the food chain. The Court of Justice said this decision was based on the precautionary principle. There are a lot of scientific unknowns here, but we can't gamble on hoping that these antibiotics won't damage humans in the sense of humans becoming resistant to antibiotics. We know that antibiotic resistance is a growing phenomena. This part of the story is just a small part, but it's an important part. So when the Commission used the precautionary principle to justify banning these antibiotics in animal feed, they were doing the right thing. So that was a good example of the precautionary principle in action.
J'ai une question supplémentaire à propos du principe de précaution. On a beaucoup parlé de l'Europe, de la Suède et de l'Union européenne. Qu'en est-il au niveau global, planétaire? Que se passe-t-il aux États-Unis? Que se passe-t-il dans le reste du monde, en Chine ou en Inde, avec ce principe de précaution?
Well, since the German decision, the German invention, it has spread to about 20 international conventions and regulations. For example, the Stockholm Agreement to phase out persistent and damaging chemicals is driven by the precautionary principle. The new chemicals regulations introduced into Europe called REACH that came in 2007, 2008, they have the principle of precaution in the preamble. And many other laws are in place that capture it. However, it's not implemented that often. So it was used several times on chemicals in Europe before REACH came along, I think just 4 times. But since REACH has arrived, it hasn't been used once. So it is actually quite rarely used. And when we look back in our book called Late Lessons from Early Warnings, looking at the history of hazards like lead in petrol, like the hole in the ozone layer, we observed in the 26 case studies that only 3 or 4 times was the PP used, twice by France. First on these pesticides that were damaging bees, and secondly on a pesticide that went into paint that you painted on the bottoms of boats to stop mollusks slowing down the boats.
Yeah.
This turned out also to damage the sexuality of oysters and other sea creatures. Males turned into females and so on. So that was banned, again on a low level of evidence, by France in 1984. And there were just a couple of examples. So it is not used that often, and we think it should be used more often. Had it been used at the right time, in the 26 case studies, a lot of damage to both people and planets would have been avoided.
Et dans le reste du monde, si on parle des pays émergents
the precautionary principle idea, they actually call it the precautionary approach, is in the global agreement to try and slow down climate change through limiting the output of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. That has got a precautionary idea in the middle of it, again because the science is so complex that by the time we have got all the answers to the complexity of the climate system, global warming will be out of control. So we have to take action before we know the full story, which is the essence of the precautionary principle.
Et vous pensez que ce principe va être de plus en plus appliqué partout dans le monde, ou pas?
It's obviously a sensible idea. When you explain it in the way that perhaps I have, I hope many people would agree it does seem better to avoid irreversible and serious harm when you've got the beginnings of evidence about that harm. But often it brings about considerable opposition from those narrow economic forces that are producing the antibiotics or producing the endocrine disrupting chemicals or the pesticides. They make a lot of money from these products, so their particular interests seem to be threatened by the PP. And it's just that the rest of society as a whole will gain from the wise and timely application of the PP, but there will be short-term losses for small groups of very powerful people. And in general, if you're going to lose something, you mobilize and try and stop yourself from losing something. If you're going to receive a benefit, like society does, you don't mobilize, you don't fight for a kind of benefit. So the political system is kind of biased towards short-term, powerful economic interests that are causing the damage and away from the majority in society and the environment, of course, which will gain. In other words, losers mobilize, people who benefit don't mobilize. So actually getting through these, getting the precautionary principle through a political process is quite difficult. You have to use examples like this: public awareness, spreading information, allowing more people to understand what's going on with their lives and their environments and their societies, and inviting them to participate rather more than they have in the past.
David, sur ce point, encore une question assez difficile. Comment appliquer ce fameux principe de précaution?
Well, the precautionary principle is applied case by case, depending on the strength of evidence that you choose to use in order to apply it. Maybe the best way to illustrate this is to use a jug of water and a glass of water.
Why not?
If you can provide those right now.
Pourquoi pas? Est-ce qu'on peut avoir... Merci, Denis. On va illustrer le propos de David. Expliquez-nous, David.
Okay, so if we use these two as illustrations of two different strengths of evidence, so there's a lot of evidence here and not much evidence here. And let us suppose we're in the criminal courts and that a person comes into the court accused of being a murderer. We assume they are innocent until we prove that they are a murderer beyond all reasonable doubt.
So
in other words, we wait for a whole jug full of evidence.
So big one.
And the consequences are that sometimes a real murderer will go free because we haven't managed to collect all that evidence. Let's go to another situation, a court where a woman comes in with 3 children, let's say, and her husband has been killed at work. And she needs some money to replace his earnings. So she sues the employer to say that you were negligent and you caused the death of my husband. So your insurance company should pay me some compensation. In that case, we give the benefit of the doubt this time to the woman. And we say, we only need 51% probability that your husband was killed by this employer. In other words, we use a lower strength of evidence on the ground that if we waited for a lot of evidence, many women with dead husbands would get no compensation. And we think that the broad shoulders of an insurance company can bear being wrong about something than the small shoulders of a lady. So we use a widow. So we use a small amount of evidence to justify giving her compensation. It means, of course, if we're wrong this time, some women will get some compensation when they shouldn't have. But to minimize that mistake, let's say, if we were to wait for a jugful, then there'd be many more women who should have got compensation who didn't. So it turns upon what are the consequences of being wrong as to which strength of evidence we use. In the criminal courts, we want a lot of evidence to put somebody in jail for 30 years, or in earlier times to execute them. So we give the benefit of the doubt to the injured party there. Whereas elsewhere, we use a small amount. So we now have some pesticides that have endocrine disrupting harm based on some scientific evidence. How much evidence do we wait for in order to convict a pesticide as being an endocrine and harmful, an endocrine disrupting and harmful pesticide? We have to choose. Many people would say, if we wait for a jug full of evidence, beyond all reasonable doubt, which incidentally is how scientists do their science. They want to have a lot of evidence to prove that A causes B, because that makes for good science. But if the consumers are already exposed to widespread pesticides, if we wait for a jug full of evidence, a lot of damage will have been done, and a lot of it is irreversible. It's cancers we can't stop appearing, it's brain damage, it's diabetes, and so on. So to control or to manage this problem of pesticides, most people would think, well, a glass full of evidence is enough. If we're wrong, then we have condemned some pesticides to being harmful that we shouldn't have. But if we wait for this amount of evidence and we're wrong, then the pesticide does a lot of damage before we convict it. So it's a societal choice. How much evidence do you wait for? With many substances that seem to have the potential to do big harm, irreversible harm, serious harm, we clearly wait for just a glass full of evidence. If something is delivering a lot of benefits to society, like fossil fuels, really, perhaps, then perhaps we'd wait for a bit more evidence before we convicted fossil fuels as being a problem.
Merci David pour toutes ces explications. On se retrouvera dans quelques instants pour évoquer l'industrie et la question de l'innovation, toujours dans le même contexte.